Welcome back to Maximum Production, a Holstein Friesian New Zealand podcast about everything to do with cows. I'm Amelia, and today we are exploring a topic that's gaining serious traction on farms across the country: embryo transfer, or ET work. So joining me today are two fantastic guests. We have Emma Poole, a Waikato dairy farmer with hands-on experience in ET, and Andrew Donoghue, the Regional Director for Australia and New Zealand at Vytelle, a leader in reproductive technology. With more farmers turning to embryo transfer to accelerate genetic progress, it's crucial to understand both the benefits and the practical realities of implementing ET work on farm. So whether you're curious, considering it, or already involved, hopefully today we can answer any questions that you may have around this topic. So Emma, do you want to give us your background and how you got to where you are today?
I studied veterinary science down in Palmerston North, so I'm a vet by trade, and then I married a dairy farmer and got taken to the Waikato, where we're now running a dairy farming operation. We have 3 dairy farms. We're milking about 1,400 cows across the 3 properties, and we also run a calf rearing business on the side of that, where we'll probably rear around 1,000 calves this season, maybe more. And we also run an embryo transfer recipient business and donor service through our property. This is where we give other clients the opportunity to implant their embryos in our milking cows, and we manage the whole service for them. So we manage from implanting through to calving the cow down and rearing the calf to 100 kilos and then returning them a live calf at the end of it. On the donor side of that, we also have a specialised donor facility where people can leave their heifers or cows with us, and they use our donor facility, and we tee up with the likes of Vytelle or whoever's doing the TVR session for that day, and they are able to harvest embryos from their own heifers, and we help to manage the nutrition and any treatments that they might need throughout that process, with the idea being, once again, that we've got a full nose to tail service where we can provide live calves through embryo transfer back to clients.
That sounds very busy.
There's a bit going on here, but yeah, it's all good news. And I guess because we split calve, it allows us to do that extra thing. And we've got lots of hands on deck to help us do all these extra things.
With that many animals calving down and all the embryo work going on, you would need a lot of helpers. So it's great that you've got a good team behind you to ensure that you can do it all well.
Absolutely. And yeah, being a family farming operation, family is obviously a huge part of it. With farming with my partner's family, his parents, John and Anne, who were the founders of this wonderful farm system. So it's cool to be taking that on as well.
Oh, it sounds really great. So Andrew, do you want to give us a little bit about your background then and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, and I'm based in Australia in New South Wales. I was born and raised on a family farming operation, mixed farm, starting commercial beef cattle and merino sheep and cropping. So quite the diverse background. About 15 years ago, we sold the family farm and I moved into agribusiness. In that time, I've had experience in ag software and then breed association. I was actually CEO of Hereford's Australia for 6 years on the breed association front. And for the last 4.5 years, I've been working with Vytelle in Australia and New Zealand. That's been a really good journey for a global company looking to spread its footprint, and Australia and New Zealand are the major focus area outside of the US for Vytelle. So in that time, in the last 3 years in particular, we've opened up 3 labs in New Zealand and Australia. New Zealand was our first company-owned lab outside of the US. We own 21 global labs around the world, with Australia and New Zealand being the 2 countries that have Vytelle-owned labs outside of the US. So it's been an exciting journey, really getting to know what Vytelle brings to the market for IVF embryos and the journey of opening labs in New Zealand and Australia, and basically what we can do to service the genetics and the embryos for beef and dairy in New Zealand and Australia.
And it's, as Emma just demonstrated to us, the uptake of embryo transfer work in general in New Zealand is really taking off. And as you said, Vytelle's only been here, 3 years now?
Yeah.
And I think you're one of the largest companies in New Zealand now doing embryo work.
Certainly, we've seen fantastic support and growth in New Zealand over the last 3 years. Embryo work in itself is not new to dairy farmers in New Zealand. I think what's really important is bringing a product that has reliability and known expectations. And that's been the important part with IVF, is trying to increase the confidence in the reliability of embryo production and the reliability of conception rates, and bringing sort of global expertise to New Zealand on what we do around the world in embryo work. And being a unique marketplace, New Zealand's a spot where we need to have really robust and good performing frozen embryos due to the seasonality of what's involved. Yeah, that's been an important part of our rollout in New Zealand, is reliability through direct transfer of frozen embryos to the marketplace.
Do you want to just give our listeners a little bit of background behind what embryo work or embryo transfer actually involves?
Traditionally, people would be used to what we call mullet embryos, or multiple ovulation embryo transfer, which typically involves stimulating a cow by the use of hormones, AIing the cow, allowing her to grow embryos out for a week in utero, and then pulling those embryos out from the cow and then sort of freezing or transferring fresh. So traditional embryo production involves a lot of donor preparation, and it involves a lot of hormones to be used to allow that process. What differs with IVF embryos is we actually do the bulk of the work in a laboratory rather than in the cow, and it has a lot of benefits over traditional embryo work. The first benefit is we're not using hormones, so there's no scheduling cows for a week or two before embryo work. You can actually leave that cow pregnant or leave her in your production system, so that cow can have a calf every year through AI or natural, however you want to mate her, as well as produce embryos for you and not go out of production. So that's a big advantage to doing IVF. Another big advantage is semen usage. So as semen gets expensive or rare, you can do multiple cows to one straw of semen. So because we're doing it in the lab, we've got a lot of control over what can be done. So effectively what we're doing with IVF is we're coming on farm or on centre, and we're collecting oocytes or unfertilised embryos from the cow, or eggs. We collect them from the donor cow. Now, that donor cow can be as young as, depending on the size of the cow, can be as young as sort of 6 or 8 months old and pre-pubertal, and we can still collect oocytes and make embryos from that, and all the way through to mature age cow. The cow can be open, it can be pregnant, it can be done at any stage because we're just pulling oocytes off the ovary. So we take those oocytes back to the lab once we've collected them from the cow, and then the next day we do the IVF process. And then over sort of 7-8 days in the lab, we're growing those embryos out using different media culture that we've refined over time. And then sort of 8 days after we collect those embryos on farm, we freeze those embryos down into frozen embryos, or we deliver them back for fresh transfer. So what is then a fully fertilised embryo that's ready to be placed into a well-selected and programmed up recipient cow.
So I guess it's not really easy to average this, but is there an average number of embryos that farmers can expect to get from a session?
Yeah.
Or is that dependent on age and everything?
Absolutely. It depends is my first answer to that. And we're backed with a lot of data, having 21 global labs. We've got a lot of data that we can refer to by breed and by age and everything like that. So yes, the younger you do them, the less embryos you'll generally produce. What we find in New Zealand, the bulk of our work on dairy donors in New Zealand is 12, 14-month-old donors. So traditionally, they're not going to produce as many embryos as a mature age cow. A really rough rule of thumb, depending on breed differences between Jersey and Holstein and crossbreds, and also on-farm differences. You'll find as much variation between Holsteins on 2 different farms. But for Holstein, we're sitting on a bit over 3, between 3 and 3.5 embryos per donor when we come on farm. And that's including the bulk of them being 12-month-old heifers.
Okay.
So if you were to look at doing cow work, you would probably be closer to 4 to 5 embryos per cow per pickup. And I think we're sitting around that 3 for Holstein heifers. So that's our experience anyway.
Is that about in line with what you're seeing on farm, Emma?
Yes, yeah, that's what we budget on, is about 3, but you've got to have an expectation of a range from 1 to 5, I guess. But yeah, that's where we come in at the 3. And I think LIC, when they run their programs and they're budgeting on, because LIC do a lot of funded programs where they select the best heifers for the Generate program, and they qualify for flushing through Vytelle to produce embryos for farmers. I think they budget around 3 as well per session.
And just to add to Emma's comment, that sort of 3 includes everything from zeros. There's always donors that don't make embryos. It's part of the life. So probably in New Zealand, that's a bit of a range of 0 through to about 17 per donor. So that's the rough range. So work on 3.
Quite often the first pickup is lower numbers too, isn't it, Andrew? Like the first pickup you do on a heifer, you might only get 1 or 2 convert, and then the second time she comes in, you'll have a better success rate. So it's quite important not to just get disheartened after one session and to follow it through and do a secondary session, because it can clear out that follicular wave, start the heifer again and sort of reprogram her almost.
Yeah, it can be a really good reset, the first OPU. What we call it OPU, I think in New Zealand, you traditionally have called it TBR. It's the same process. It's the harvesting of oocytes. So that first session of OPU or TBR can be a good reset. And another thing, as well as older cows giving you more embryos, you also find pregnant heifers. So a yearling heifer pre-joining will give you lower numbers. If you get that heifer in calf and then come in and do her after she's in calf, you can get some really good results there too. So there's some little things that still allow you to access young genetics, but we also understand that a lot of the progressive breeders want to be pulling embryos out of yearling heifers to go into recips the same time that heifer's getting mated for the first time. And that's the beauty that IVF has brought to any genetic progress, is the really advanced people. Their elite heifers are having 5, 6 calves hit the ground when they're having their first calf. So it's really increasing that rate of genetic gain, reproducing more of your newest genetics, which should be your best genetics, and traditional embryo programs through hormones and flushing haven't been reliable or successful on young heifers. So it's really a great way to increase genetic gain.
Yeah, it definitely is. You mentioned about picking up oocytes from pregnant animals. What is the risk to the pregnancy in doing that?
There's technically no risk to the pregnancy. In the act of doing the oocyte pickup won't affect the pregnancy. The pregnancy obviously embeds into the horn of the uterus and then in the uterus itself. And we're only going to the ovary to do the pickup. So we're not going anywhere near the pregnancy. Obviously, early pregnancy, if a donor's the first sort of 3, 4, 5 weeks of pregnancy, any sort of handling stress event can have an adverse effect on pregnancy. So we would always recommend having caution around early pregnancy. But once that pregnancy is bedded down, you've got generally through to about 120 days pregnant where you can do the pickup. And it's only a physical limitation once they get past sort of 120 days that makes it really hard to pull the ovaries back up for aspirating that stops us doing it. But if you've got a well embedded pregnancy, there's very minimal risk to the pregnancy from doing the pickups.
I guess the first thing that farmers need to be thinking about when they're looking at doing this kind of work is picking the right cow, the right donor animal. So I guess from your point of view, Emma, how do you and your partner Chris make these decisions around the donor cows that you choose?
Yeah, it's a good question. The first part of it would be genetic merit. So are they worthy of going through this program? Because it is costly. So you don't want to be doing it on just any old animal. The second part of it is how well are they growing? So once you've got your list of high genetic merit animals, have they reached their target rates? Have they had any health incursions through their life? They might have had pneumonia at some point or something like that that's going to affect their overall health status. And then I guess the third is accessibility. Are they offered a grazing block somewhere, or are they at home in your front paddock? So for us, a lot of the work that we do personally is more through the funded programs. So looking at trying to get animals that qualify for LIC's Generate program. And that's a great way for us to get embryos back on farm without having to outlay a huge amount of costs, because LIC obviously have a vested interest in producing those embryos and getting good genetics out there for the country and for the bull team. We have done some cows ourselves, and that's just again been cows that we've picked out that Chris has thought are a nice type, they've top scored well or something like that, and that we just think would be good to breed from for our herd. But yeah, making sure that a healthy animal is a really big step in the right direction, and the management up to the point of their first flush and subsequent flushes is really important too. So you've got to make sure you're not making any changes rapidly in the 2-week period before they're flushed. You want stable nutrition. You don't want them coming off a truck from somewhere. You just want them nice and settled, quietly handled and brought into the crush nicely for their day of TBR.
So, are there any common pitfalls that farmers should be aware of or that they've fallen into that have made either the animals that they've chosen as donors not suitable, or there being reasons why things aren't progressing the way that they were hoping to?
When you start doing embryo work, you're introducing the cow into the genetic progress equation. Traditionally, with physical sire mating and AI, you're dealing with bringing in new genetics through the semen, but your cow herd, it is what it is, and you can't do much about that. The beauty of embryo work is it allows you to also give a lot of merit to the cow side of things. So the very first thing, if you're doing any embryo work, is to identify and rank your best females. How people do that varies from production system to production system, but generally it's some sort of genetic evaluation gives you the first look into what your elite females are. And it's really important because compared to using just AI, you're looking at 5 times the genetic progress by using embryos. And that's extremely powerful if those donors you've selected are the right donors that take you in the right direction. It's also extremely dangerous if you choose the wrong donors because you'll be going 5 times as quickly in the wrong direction. So having a really effective donor selection strategy is so important to make sure they're taking you where you want to go. And we've seen the growth of IVF in particular over other embryo work is very closely linked to the introduction of genomics into genetic evaluation and genotyping because it's effectively allowed females to be ranked at a younger age through genomic predictions and also to have work done at a younger age. So as we see genetic evaluations incorporate more genomics and give more accuracy on females, you get the ability to be pulling young females into the program that have high genetic merit and actually make embryos from them. So it goes hand in hand with the way that genetic evaluations are going. And obviously, once you've got the genetics as a selection criteria, there's other phenotypic and other criteria that have to come into it as well. But I guess the message is that make sure you're reproducing the right genetics because you're going very fast.
And I guess that plays into the fact that if you are wanting to breed from these animals, it's an easy way to expand that genetic merit. From a breed society point of view, we do actually require you to DNA verify all ET progeny, and they need to be verified to both dam and sire here in New Zealand. So by doing that before you even think about flushing her or you think about collecting those oocytes, you've already taken that first step, because when the ET animal hits the ground, it's very easy for you to ensure that there is a match there. The amount of farmers out there that forget to take a DNA sample from the dam is just astronomical. I've had people that have cut ears off dead cows, and I can tell you right now they're still sitting in the freezer because they never got around to taking that DNA sample and sending it off, and now they've got daughters and they can't register the daughters. So it's another bonus reason to do that at that time.
Aside from the regulations reasons for needing DNA, you actually want to make sure that that donor cow is who you think she is, not just at a pedigree level, but also at a performance level, because increasingly genomics is giving you more insight to their true genetic merit. So really important that any proposed donor would be fully genotyped and you know exactly what you're dealing with there. And I guess just talking about ranking females and using embryos, we see it increasingly where a breeder may have some females he definitely wants a lot more of, and a percentage of their herd might be very good, phenotypically sound, doing the job, but just not genetics they want to replicate. And we're increasingly seeing once you do rank your females, not only are you identifying your elite ones, you're also identifying maybe your bottom 10, 20, 40%, which they're a sound cow, but you just don't want more of them. And they can become the ideal recipient cow where you put the genetics from your top cows into those ones and they're actually becoming your recipient herd and having a really good purpose in your herd as well.
Emma, is that how you guys normally select your recipients? Is it by what Andrew said, looking at those animals that are in that bottom 10 to 20%, or do you select them in a different way?
There's multiple factors that go into our selection. So firstly, the recipient cow has to be between the age of 2 and 7 years old and be in our milking herd. We do offer beef recipients from time to time, but that's a whole nother kettle of fish. But for the dairy recipients, yeah, they have to be 2 to 7. They have to have no health incursions. So if they've had metritis or difficult calving, then they're off the list. They also have to have been an early calver because the system we run, we calve the recipients down before the main herd. And that's so that we can be vigilant and fresh while we're calving these down. We don't want to be calving ET calves in the middle of calving when we're a bit jaded and tired. So we calve them down ahead of the main herd, and then they also have to have completed a full vaccination program before they can qualify as a recipient. So that's to protect the embryo before it's born. Things that we vaccinate against are BVD, Salmonella, Leptospirosis, that's mainly for the human factor for working around these animals. And we give them a rotavirus vaccine before they calve as well, and that's to enhance the colostrum quality going to that embryo calf as it's born. The other thing that we have been very careful on selection is pin distance. So that's the distance between the 2 pins at the rear end of the cow. And we often don't check this until implant day. So if a cow is narrow or the pins are located too closely together, we've found that the calves can be more difficult to get out. So you don't want to go through this whole process and have a calf that you can't get out of the cow at the other end. So it's not uncommon for us to drop a recipient on the day of implanting based on pin distance.
I think it's also embryo calves can quite often be larger than natural calves. So I guess having that rump width wider is possibly a beneficial thing, even looking at it from that perspective. Or are you finding, Emma, that there's not really much difference size-wise?
No, there's definitely difference in side-wise. So this is probably a conversation that lots of your listeners have come here today to hear because there's been a lot of chatter on social media about birth weight of ET calves. Is that correct, Amelia?
Yep, a lot of people have been inquiring about it over the last few months.
And the thing not to get caught up in that is lots of people that have opinions on ET work might be calving quite low numbers. So they might have calved 1 or 2 ETs down in their group, and they might have had 1 large calf and 1 normal calf. So you've just got to be wary of where you're taking information from, would be my caution to the listeners. But in the last batch of ETs that we calved down, there was 40 in the batch, and they were all Vytelle produced embryos. And we weigh all of our calves on an accurate scale at birth. So this is quite accurate data. We had a minimum birth weight of 17 kilos and a maximum birth weight of 62 kilos. And this is in Holstein Friesians, so they were purebreds. In saying that, 62 kilos is a large calf for sure, but I have, as a vet in the community, have pulled out lots of calves that are that size, not from ET work. So that sort of range is not unexpected in a New Zealand calving system, I wouldn't say. The average for that group sat around the 42 kilo mark, so very in line with what the rest of their age group would be, slightly larger maybe.
It's pretty standard for a Holstein Friesian newborn calf, though, around about 40 kilos.
Exactly. And what we did find was that calves that were over 55 kilos, and unfortunately we only know this information retrospectively because you can't weigh a calf inside a cow. If they're over 55 kilos, they 100% of the time need assistance. No matter how big the recipient is, you're best to intervene. And if they're over the 60 kilo mark, you're really heading into C-section territory. Again, it's dependent on the power and depth of the cow that's calving the animal down and the distance between those pins. But over 60 kilos, you should really be considering whether or not you should be approaching a C-section. And from that batch, we did 2 C-sections and the rest were natural births.
Oh, yeah, so that's not really that bad out of 40 animals.
It's not bad. In one of the C-sections, I actually palpated the calf rectally and thought it was large and then brought the animal in. We did a nominated C-section. I've got small children, so I wanted to do it at a time where I had childcare and we would have the best outcome for the cow and calf. So we did it on a nice sunny afternoon. And when I got the calf out, it was actually a 45 kilo calf. So in hindsight, possibly not completely necessary, but we sort of made the best educated decision we could at the time. And then, funnily enough, about 2 hours later, that evening, we had a genuine C-section that we had to do.
When you didn't have childcare, I'm guessing.
That's the one.
Yeah, that's normally how it goes. Andrew, do you have anything else that you wanted to add regarding that calf size discussion?
Absolutely. And I appreciate Emma's openness to her experience, and I would say that would endorse everything that Emma said from the range and everything she spoke to. Basically, we work on sort of three key pillars around recipient calving and calving management, and three sort of main pillars that affect the calving outcome. And the first one is, it's a really obvious one, but it's one that people do tend to forget, and that's the genetic contribution of the sire and the donor dam. So the first thing is really put some consideration into the calving ease and birth weight information around the sire and dam. If you're using genetics that would potentially give you large calves, just through the fact that you're making embryos means you're going to have more large calves than usual because you're making multiple embryos from that mating outcome. So if it's a mating outcome that would potentially give large calves, all of a sudden, if you've done 2 OPU sessions, all of a sudden you've got 6, 8 embryos that you're putting in that could potentially give you calving problems. So you're multiplying the incidence of calving problems if the genetics are that way inclined. The second biggest factor we see for calf size with embryo is actually gestation length and due date and monitoring that. So it's having really good records around when you transfer, which of those recipients are actually in calf to the embryo and when they're actually due. And due date or gestation length is from heat day, not from transfer day. It's simple, I know, but it's often forgotten. But what we don't want to see is recipient cows being let go 15, 20 days overdue because you're really growing a large calf inside a recipient if they go well overdue. Managing due date and making sure if recipients aren't calving around that due date is talking to your local vet around any intervention that might be required, because any recipient that overcooks by 2 weeks or more is just going to have a large calf. And there's some questions we would normally ask straight out around large calves is, what's the genetic outcome of this embryo, but also how is the due date? And the third pillar that we like to look into is recipient selection and management, and more so management around calf size. How is that recipient managed through the pregnancy cycle? How is the last trimester? Is there any sort of management factors that could be creating some sort of calf size issue? Just on Emma's comments there around general IVF calves, we've got some big data sets from some very controlled environments of Holstein embryos. And what that data set has told us is that on average across all these thousands of calves on the ground, so a really robust data set, we found approximately about a 10% average birth weight difference between the IVF and the AI calves. So if you've got a 38 kilo average through AI, you're going to have a 41 or 2 kilo average through IVF. It's going to be around that 10% difference. So there is birth weight coming in from the IVF process, but it's not enormous. And as Emma alluded to, sort of 60 kilo calves are not ideal, but they're also prevalent through natural and AI matings as well. Possibly, if it's the genetics contributing to that, whilst it might only be one calf in that genetic makeup in an AI joining, it could be 5 or 6 through IVF just due to the fact that there's more embryos being made. So keeping things in context, but proactive recipient management around calving time from sort of a week or two before due date, and then really monitoring around that due date is important. We've got high value genetics. You've spent a lot of money creating embryos and putting them in the recipients, and it should be a very proactive time around calving to make sure that they're all coming out as safely as possible and both recipient and calf are healthy.
Emma, Andrew just mentioned about those animals that are going overdue. From the embryo work that you're doing, are you finding that there is a significant number of them going over their due date, or are you seeing any flow-on effect there, or are most of them calving within, a day or two of their due date?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. What we've found with the recipients is because they are a surrogate, there's some sort of maternal fetal recognition failure in some of the embryos that calve down. Chris and I obviously calved a lot of cows now, and we've got a pretty good eye for what a dairy cow looks like when she's calving down. What we've found is that the recipients, because of their embryo factor, sometimes they either spring up really quickly or spring up quite slowly. So they can behave and act a little bit differently to what your typical dairy pregnancy would. And because of that, you need to be really, really vigilant, and you actually need to be keeping an eye on them up to 2 weeks before their due date, and you need to be checking them regularly. We have found that a lot of them do go overdue, yes, and a lot of people that I talk to in the community have questions around whether or not they should induce. My answer to that would be it needs to be cow specific. I'm not for batch inductions. I know that a lot of the breeding companies' advice is to induce on due date so that you don't have cows going over. But from my experience as a vet, there's some recipients that if you induce them even on due date, they won't respond well to that induction because they're simply not ready. And that seems to be some sort of because of the unknown with ET work in it, because it's not actually her pregnancy and she doesn't have that fetal feedback that a typical mother would be if she was genetically related to the animal. So handle inductions with care, make sure that the cow is ready. It's good to have a vet palpate them rectally and make sure that there's actually a calf sitting up high in the pelvis and ready to come out.
I know that there was a lot of people this year that got to the point after they had that scare with other people coming out saying, oh, my calves are coming out huge, that they were just trying to give blanket drop shots. And so that would go along with what you're saying as well. Like before you look at doing that, actually talking to your vet, getting them to actually check the cow out and see if she's ready for that.
Absolutely. And I know of people that panicked and drop shotted 10 days out from their due date. And the result was that you need to be prepared for a high number of C-sections if you're going to do that, because the cows simply will not dilate appropriately to get one of these calves out the rear end. If you've got a 45 kilo calf, you need the cow to be really well dilated. She needs to have gone through the proper process of coming into pregnancy. They release a hormone called relaxin very close to giving birth, and that hormone helps to relax the pelvic ligaments, and you'll see that tail drops and around the vulva it all gets very loose. You really need the recipient to be at that stage before she's calving. Otherwise, it's simply going to be too tight for you to get a calf out. And if you are pulling a 45 kilo calf out a very tight vagina, the result on the calf will be a huge amount of stress, possibly internal bleeding, splenic rupture, that sort of thing. And you'll deliver what you think is a stillborn calf, but it was actually previously alive, but it's just been too stressed through the birthing process.
And as Andrew said, you've spent a lot of money to get it to this point. You really would prefer to have a live calf.
Absolutely.
I think what you've said there is completely accurate. Really think about those decisions before you make them and talk about it with your vet to make sure that you are making the right decision to benefit both the calf and the recipient. Sorry.
And we totally echo that strategy.
That's another thing to be mindful to your listeners, Amelia, about the difference between beef heifers as a recipient and dairy cows as a recipient. There's lots of people that use beef heifers because they have a higher hold rate to conception than what a in-milk dairy cow would per se. But you have to be mindful of the losses at the other end if you're going to balance that equation. So although you might get a higher hold rate in a beef heifer, you're probably more likely to lose more calves as they birth. And you certainly need to be handling inductions with care in beef heifer recipients. And that's because they can take longer for those hormones to relax all of those pelvic ligaments and the vaginal ligaments than what a dairy cow can. So if you are prematurely inducing those beef heifers, the result will be that you'll be pulling a large calf through a very, very tight vaginal canal and doing a lot of damage. So once again, it needs to be a case-by-case decision as to whether or not you do induce and at what time you do that.
I think the beef dairy comparison is quite good. So you mentioned that the hold rates differ between them. Would you say that you would use a more mature beef animal if you were doing it because of that, or would you still aim for your beef animals to be from the age of 2?
The beef heifer's sort of the holy grail of recipients in terms of hold rates because she's so clean. She's never had a calf before. She hasn't had a health incursion and she's under no stress, right? You pull her off of a beef block somewhere, and what does a beef animal have to worry about in comparison to a dairy lactating animal? If you were to use a beef cow, this isn't something that's very common. And I'd say it's primarily an access issue. Like, it would be a large cost to, say you're a dairy farmer wanting to get genetic gain. You're talking about carrying a beef herd for 3 to 4 years before she's a mature cow to use as a recipient. And I just don't think that's economically viable for most dairy farmers to have this beef herd floating around. Whereas a beef heifer, they may or may not, have bred some surplus heifers from their dairy cows. They've only had to carry them for 18 months before they implant them. So I think there's probably more of an economic argument there. And then if you're using an in-milk dairy recipient, your bottom BW cow that met all of those other requirements that we talked about, you already have that animal, you already own it, she's already in milk, but you have to accept that you're probably going to get a lower conception rate.
Just to add to that, the established dairy cow is probably the ideal recipient for the back end when we're getting to calving. It's just making sure to maximise your preg rates from production dairy cows. The limiting factor is normally, are they getting the nutrition that they need to be a fairly high producing, even if they're the lower end of the herd's genetics, but they'll be high producing dairy cows producing a lot of milk, and making an embryo stick is probably not their number one priority if they're nutritionally challenged. So recip selection and setup well prior to transfer is it's really important to have their nutrition right, and that we've seen it everywhere where we operate. The better nutrition and the better setup the recipient is, the better conception rates you're going to get. So if they're nutritionally challenged and not well looked after, you can probably expect to get some fairly low initial conception rates just due to the challenges that recip's under.
I noticed, Emma, you said 18 months old with the beef animals. So you're still wanting them to be at that kind of 90% fully grown before you're looking at actually carving these animals down, aren't you? You're not looking at someone putting these embryos into beef cattle that are only, 12 months old, or you're putting them into them earlier so they're carving down at 14, 15 months. You do still want them to be fully grown so that they are actually able to carve down a fully grown calf. Is that right?
Absolutely, and that comes down to pin width again and how well they're set up. I know there's an outfit in New Zealand, they use primarily white face cross animals out of the dairy sector, so they're sort of Hereford cross Holstein Friesians usually, and they make quite a good recipient in terms of their ability to get it out the back end, but you certainly don't want to be putting it in, a narrow heifer that's undergrown. It's just a recipe for disaster.
I guess we should possibly talk a little bit more about hold rates. Andrew, what are the average hold rates farmers should expect when doing this kind of work?
That's a really good question, and it depends. We have put together what we've called a global pregnancy summary, which collates a lot of data that we've pulled in globally from preg checks, and a large chunk of this data is dairy data from well-controlled production systems. And I think that's probably the key here is well-controlled production systems have the ability to ensure nutritional requirements are well met. When we talk rule of thumb for frozen embryos, we work on a range between sort of 45 and 55% conception rate is the expected range. Can be more than that, can be less than that because of other factors. If people are lucky enough to be in a position where they can do fresh transfers, we find sort of 5 to 10% better conception rates from fresh embryos. So globally, we look at sort of 50 to 65% for fresh. The global summary that we brought out was on over 27,000 preg checks, and it really mirrors that. The frozen success rate was sitting on 49% and the fresh was sitting on 54%. So that's what we would expect. We did speak a little bit before about sort of full production cows being nutritionally challenged. You can find some challenges in getting some good conception rates from that. We've also got scenarios where we've got full production cows getting fed a ration and getting easily sort of 50 to 60% conception rate because their needs are being met. So I think individual results will obviously vary compared to the management of the recipients, but that's sort of what the data is showing us around sort of global rates.
Does this match up, Emma, to what you're seeing on farm?
It does, but I guess you need to be wary of the range as well. So it wouldn't be unusual doing embryo work to get a hold rate of 30% in lactating dairy cows. And a lot of what Andrew's talked about is, those overlying factors that come into that. Was there a period of bad weather leading up to your implant date? Were you a bit short on feed on farm, and all of those sort of factors? So you do have to be mindful of the events leading up to the implantation date, and often these are booked months or weeks in advance because you've run a heat synchrony program to line up for this. So yeah, what Andrew's saying is fairly in line with what we're seeing. Sometimes we're a little bit lower than that, but I guess for your listeners to not be disheartened or not have unrealistic expectations of ending up consistently getting 60%, and that the 30% hold rate will come at some stage depending on what's been going on farm at the time.
A really good indicator or a good tool for telling us what we might be about to expect is if they're running a fixed time AI program on their cows, it's a really good yardstick for female management and reproductive status and also programming ability. And we tend to find that a fresh embryo should get within 10% of a fixed time AI result, and then a frozen embryo would be another 5 or so percent behind that. So I guess the reason for bringing this up is that if you get 40 to 45% in a fixed time AI program, you're not going to get 50, 55% from embryos. It's not going to happen. So a 45% AI result would indicate an embryo result somewhere down in the 30s. So it's just a yardstick for people that haven't had any experience with embryo success rate. But if they know what their fixed time AI, if that's a thing that they're doing, then that's a really good yardstick.
So you've mentioned frozen embryos. How long can frozen embryos last before their quality starts to degrade?
I think so long as they're stored right, obviously they've got to be frozen in a tank, prepared correctly, and the tank is well maintained, but indefinitely. Generally, like anything, the genetics would be outdated far earlier than it would be no longer usable. So my advice to anyone doing embryo work is the best place for those embryos is into a recipient, because you spend money making them, genetics move that quickly. The last thing you want is a tank full of old genetics. If you're making them, get them in.
My family had 8 embryos that sat in storage for 18 years before my brother went share milking, and then Dad was like, can you put them in something? He had 4 of them hold, and he got 3 bulls and 1 heifer. He got 1 heifer, so better than nothing.
Yeah.
What effect does the embryo work that you're doing actually have on either the donor cow or the recipient cow's ability to get back in calf? Is this something that could affect fertility, or is the collecting of these oocytes not doing that much damage in that area?
From a recipient point, one thing to be mindful of with embryos is you get quite a lot of long returns. So they hold initially and then they seem to drop the pregnancy. So this is where it becomes difficult for dairy farms to do at a large scale, because we're such a seasonally based calving system in New Zealand. If you're mucking around with your mating too much and putting in too many embryos, the result could be a lot of long returns and cows that end up late in calf. And if you were to do that year after year, your whole mating might sort of get a bit skew-whiff and you'd end up with too many late calvers. We're fortunate that we run a split calving system, and it's probably how this embryo business has evolved within our business. And so calving date's not such an issue for us. But we do get a lot of long returns from the embryos, so you do have to be careful there.
For the donor side, I guess that's where IVF has an advantage over traditional embryo work, is you get a lot more longevity out of your donor cows because you're not using hormones, and continual hormones for a flushing program can have a negative effect on the long-term viability of that donor. So we don't see too many negative side effects. It's really important. We get very insistent on good facilities to do the work, and that in itself is around safety and longevity of the donor cow. We like to be working in a squeeze chute, and for no other reason than we want that cow to be as still as possible while we're doing the work. If you've got an environment where that donor cow is jumping around whilst through the oocyte collection, we're not actually entering into the ovary to collect the oocytes. They sit on the outside of the ovary. We're just collecting them from the outside. If you've got conditions where there's too much movement from the donor cow, there is a risk that through her movement there can be damage done. It's a very low risk, and our operators are really quite highly skilled at doing this, and we don't see very much of it. But it's a bit more context as to why we want to make sure we're operating in the best conditions, because we want the best outcome for your donor, and we also want the best outcome for the embryos we produce. The environment that we do the collections can affect that. So the process done in a good facility would see very, very minimal effect on long-term donor. And it's due to not using hormones. We use very fine equipment, fine needles, because of the skill level of the technicians, so we're not leaving any scarring behind or anything like that.
Between the two of you, when you're looking at the cost and the effort and everything like that goes into this, Emma, are you seeing it as being a cost-effective procedure to be running on farm? As Andrew said, you are spending a lot of money to get your end results, so is that money that you're spending worthwhile? And I guess from your point of view also, Andrew, like how that costing kind of works.
It's a good question. I think embryo work is not for the faint-hearted, and it also depends through what means you're getting your embryos from. So if it's through one of the funded programs, it's obviously a lot more economic to get a calf out the other side. Difficult to say whether it's economic, because the long-term return is that better genetic value animal that you can breed from in the future. So my advice would be, if you're really into genetics, you're chasing that gain, you want to be in the top, then it's something that you should definitely be considering. If genetics are not really your cup of tea and you're not that phased on it, this could be a lot of effort for what might seem like initially not a lot of reward, and it's not until later that you're going to see the reward when you get those large-scale herd improvements. So yeah, that'd be my wrap on it.
As we mentioned before, you're really chasing 5 times genetic gain by doing embryo work. So if we're looking at it compared to other options being sort of AI, what your drop of calves next year, it would be 5 years time before you'd have those sort of genetics in your herd if you went down the AI route. So I think when you're looking at cost per genetic gain, it is quite a cost-effective tool. The main thing is conception rate hurts when it comes to the cost per calf, and that's ultimately we're looking at cost per calf on the ground. So making sure we're doing everything we can to select and manage the right recipients into that program. We can do the best thing that we can to produce a robust frozen embryo for you. If there's corners cut or poor selection decisions and management of recipients, all it's going to do is increase the cost of that genetic gain. So from the embryo level, we work on outcome-based pricing. We only charge per embryo produced. If you bring a cow to us and she doesn't make any embryos, you don't pay us any money. We're backing our ability to make embryos, and it just takes the risk of the sort of shopping bill of expenses that was traditionally associated with doing embryo work sort of isn't there when you're working on an outcome-based embryo pricing.
What advice would you give to farmers who are thinking about undergoing embryo work in the future?
I think it's a really exciting space to be working in. That's why we got into it in the first place. When you deliver a live embryo transfer calf out of a recipient animal, there's just no greater reward. You just get so excited, especially knowing it's come out of one of your bottom cows, and now you've got maybe 3 or 4 copies of one of your top cows. And if you are looking to get into it, make sure you have that passion and desire and drive for that to be your final outcome. But also spend your money wisely. We're looking at a minimum cost of $1,000 to get a live calf, but the reality is it probably costs a lot more than that by the time you synchronize animals and have some losses along the way, etc. So make sure that you're spending your money wisely, and that if you're going to manage the recipients yourself, 98% of them will calve at midnight. If they're calving during the day, it's probably because you missed them starting to calve at midnight. You need to be up with these animals. Make sure that you are planning to calve them down at a time when you've got energy and enthusiasm to do it, so not in the middle of calving. I would be certainly looking at running them as a separate mob and keeping them somewhere close to your house, because no one wants to be down the back of the farm checking cows at midnight.
That's great advice, Emma. And Andrew, one last thing for you. How do you see the role of embryo transfer evolving in the next 5 to 10 years?
I guess if Australia and New Zealand follow global trends, the IVF embryo, it's now responsible for about 87% of the global embryos. With more advances in reliability of the embryo and conception rate, more and more people are taking it on. So I think it's going to be an increasingly important part of the production system. It is the ultimate way to increase your genetic gain and make sure you've got more of the good genetics around you. The main advice coming out of it is this is moving really quickly. Make sure you're creating the right genetics. So put a lot of attention into donor selection and also put even more attention into recipient selection and management, and talk to people like Emma. People that know what they're doing are generally getting some really good results. So don't cut corners, do it properly, and you'll get a good result out of it.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I think you've both given us a lot of information and a lot of things for farmers out there to think about. So a huge thank you to both Emma and Andrew for sharing their time and expertise today and on-farm experiences along the lines of embryo transfer work. Your insights are invaluable to anyone looking into taking their herd to the next level and trying to use this method as a way of improving their genetics. And if you do want to get in touch with Vytelle about getting some embryo work done, all their details are on their website, which we'll link in our show notes for you. And if you're interested in the work that Emma and Chris are doing, you guys have got a Facebook page, don't you, Emma?
Yes, we're Cloverleaf Farms.
We will link the Cloverleaf Farms Facebook page as well, so then you can always just flick them a message through Facebook if you want to look into what they're doing there. Otherwise, if you've got any other questions about today's topic, or if there's something else you'd love us to cover, reach out to me via our website, Facebook or Instagram, which you'll find all those links in our show notes. So thank you for listening. I will be back next month with a new guest and a new topic. Until then, happy farming. Bye.